Thank you very much. It is always wonderful to be well received, so, so thank you. But it is also wonderful to be said goodbye with enthusiasm too, so I hope that at the end you also say goodbye in such a warm manner. There is in United States, there is a man called Werner Erhard. Some of you may know, and he had some seminars or training that he called the EST training, Erhard Special Training or something like that. And they had a practice in the training which consisted in acknowledging when somebody said something, whatever it was, people would acknowledge, clapping. Now he asked me one day to make a comment about this, and I said that this clapping was a very interesting thing, because although in this particular training was acknowledging, clapping is also approval. So people could say the most terrible things, incest happenings, whatever you wish, and then at the end of this person speaking, everybody would acknowledge. And this was a very wonderful thing, because not only you were acknowledged, but you had the emotion of that you were respected, because whatever you did was in a way approved. Not necessarily in terms of value, but in terms of something that happened to a human being, and by that very happening was legitimate. So thank you very much for making me legitimate by clapping. I shall begin making a summary of what I did last week, and at the same time stating the grounds for what I want to do now, and in the process answer some of the questions that I have received. In daily life, we live a world of objects, of entities that we handle in our interactions, in our relations, as entities that are there independent of what we do. And we live in that way normally without difficulty. If we belong to a particular well-integrated community, usually no difficulties arise. If we participate in a well-integrated domain of work, usually no difficulties arise, because all the entities that we deal with, material entities or conceptual entities, are handled in common in a simple, easy manner. So we leave them and we act in relation to them as if they existed with independency from us. And this is perfectly okay until some particular questions arise or some particular kind of conflict arise. For example, a disagreement. Two statements or two visions that, as they are presented, they oppose each other. Usually, most of these disagreements are trivial, logical disagreements. For example, if I were to say 2 by 2 equals 5, one could say, no, there is a mistake. And one can easily show that there is a mistake in the context of understanding of what a multiplication is, by showing that the multiplication has to do with addition. So what you have in here indeed is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. So you have 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. So you have 4. But notice that this is a mistake in relation to the operation that constitutes multiplication. No, I'm not saying nothing special about multiplication. I'm only saying that this disagreement, 2 by 2 equals 5. No, it is not the case. Equals 4 is trivial. And it's trivial because we handle it in terms of the operations that constitute that particular domain in which the statement takes place, multiplication. So this is wrong in terms of what constitutes a multiplication. Those disagreements are trivial. Maybe very complex, but trivial. Sometimes not so easy to see, but trivial, because all that you do is to look at the conditions of constitution of the operations of the domain in which the statement is made, and nothing else happens. But there are certain disagreements that are not trivial. There are certain disagreements in which we encounter ourselves in opposition with the other in a manner that we leave a threat to our existence, to our identity. And those disagreements are usually lived with a great passion. They may lead to separation. They may lead to aggression. And if one were to inquire in the depths of the disagreement, one would find that they are not logical disagreements. They are presented and lived as logical disagreements, but they are not logical disagreements. They are disagreements in which one of the participants makes a statement in one domain of coherences, and the other participant makes a statement in another domain of coherences. None of them realizes that they are saying perfectly valid things in their respective domains of coherences, think that they are both speaking in the same domain of coherences, and claim that the other is mistaken. If one were able to reflect upon the foundations of each statement and look at them, both participants might eventually discover that their disagreement have to do with the domain in which they are talking, and realize, oh, we are talking different things. Now, if we realize that we are talking different things, and we remain in the we, that is, we remain in this domain in which the other has legitimacy with us, again, that disagreement can be solved. Yet, it's a very serious one because one feels threatened until one discovers that the two disagreeing parties are in different domains of logic, of coherences, of whatever it is. And each one is impeccably correct, logically impeccable in his or her statement. But there are other disagreements of this latter kind in which the discovery that one is speaking in different domains cannot be solved easily because the we disappears. One claims that one is right and the other is wrong in the fundaments. And in those cases, the claim is, I know how things are, you do not know. I am objective, you are subjective. You don't see how reality is, or whatever it is. So, there are moments in which this normal way of handling the world, and I mean the world we live, in terms of objects and entities that exist there independently from us, fails. But not only fails under those circumstances, it also fails under other circumstances. For example, whenever one enters into a study through which one wishes to understand one's own participation in what is taking place. if you want to understand how perception takes place as a phenomenon of the living system, as a phenomenon that involves the nervous system, you find some difficulties. There are certain questions that you can handle with tranquility, as if the world existed made of entities that exist independently from you. You can go to the moon, you can make a robot, you can send something to Mars and to take samples from the Earth, make chemical analysis. For all that, no problem. But when you ask the question about perception, about consciousness, about language, the situation is not so simple. And it's not so simple because something appears which previously one has dismissed without much difficulty. And what appears is that one cannot, in the experience, distinguish what in communal life we call perception and illusion. Usually, in our culture, whenever we find a situation in which perception and illusion are not distinguishable, we dismiss illusion and we value perception. We say, oh, illusions, illusions are illusions. I mean, you don't want to live illusions. And we speak as if this distinction could be made completely. And we do not take seriously the experiential situation in which, when we had the experience and we thought that we were having a perception, we afterwards devaluated it as an illusion. We do not take seriously that in the moment in which we lived that which we afterwards said was an illusion, we lived it indistinguishably from what we would live something that afterwards we would call a perception. Now, this is not a new question. This has not appeared in modern life. This is a very old question. Oriental religious traditions or Oriental philosophies, Hinduism, Buddhism, for example, Taoism also, although not so directly, recognize this experiential indistinguishability. Buddhism recognizes that you cannot distinguish between perception and illusion in the experience, but concludes that everything is illusion. We in modern times conclude, as scientists, conclude that everything is perception or illusion doesn't count. It's a mistake. It's an error. Can be dismissed. I think that this situation requires reflection. I myself invite you, and this is what I have been doing last week or in my writings, invite to accept the experiential situation in which we cannot distinguish in the experience between perception and illusion as a matter of fact. This is how we live. And not dismiss perception, nor dismiss illusion, and say, aha, how is it that we operate in the manner that we operate, even though we are systems which cannot distinguish in the experience between perception and illusion. So the whole question that I am presenting and the whole series of reflections that I am developing, I developed last week, I am making a summary of some of these things today, have to do with the awareness and acceptance as a legitimate starting point that in the experience we cannot distinguish between what we call perception and illusion, and not dismissing everything that is not perception as not viable, as illusion, as we do in our culture, or not everything is the same thing, illusion that is not reality, or whatever one claims, one says everything is illusion in Buddhism, for example, or before Buddhism in the Hindu tradition from which Buddhism arises. But in order to face this question, one must do certain reflections. And the reflections that we must do, of course, we must do them in the culture to which we belong. Here we are, Western people, thinking, the manner of thinking of Western people, analytical, rational, scientific in many ways, with the philosophical traditions that we have, with a manner of thinking in which we think about explanations in a certain way. We want to make a reflection precisely on the foundations of that very thinking that we are going to use for making that reflection. We want to reflect upon our thinking using the thinking that we have, because we cannot get out of it. I put a question mark on objects, yet I must speak objects. I put a question mark on the confidence that one can handle perceptions and illusions as different kinds of phenomena belonging to a culture which claims that that can be done, aware that that cannot be done, but using the languaging, the talking of that culture that claims that that can be done. So this is the situation. And that situation I define by asking the question about the knower, the observer. One can still read a little bit what was not fully erased. Observer, observing. So we do observing, we operate as observers, and I want to invite you, and this is an invitation only. I have no way, no one of us has any way of forcing somebody else to ask a question or to think in some way without taking a tremendous strain. I'm not going to force you. I invite you consequences of certain reflections. And since I'm inviting you to make certain reflections, to follow the consequence of certain reflections, I invite you in the same domain in which you and I exist, which is the domain of the culture, Western culture, in which our reflections, our rationalizations take place. So I want to reflect upon the observer. If you do not want to follow this, then goodbye. But it's an invitation. That means if you say goodbye, it's perfectly legitimate. There is no blame in it. But I want, this is what I was doing last week, reflect upon what do we do when we operate as observers. How come that we do what we do when we operate as observers? And I claim that every one of us is an observer, so every one of us has these characteristics, and I say we are observers as we behave as the particular kind of living system that we are in the praxis of living, or in the happening, because it happens to us, happening of living, or in the experience of living in language. I say the observer is any one of us making what we observers do, which is distinctions reflections, and we do these things while we are alive. If we die, we cannot claim that we go on being observers. Sometimes we say that after we die we shall be observers of a different kind, but we cannot claim it. In this domain of living, statements about what happens outside living have an entirely different character. They do not belong to experience, they belong to literature. They belong to stories that we tell as manners of experiencing, but not of the kind that happen in our living. So I'm speaking about us, living systems, in language, doing what we do as observers, and I am inviting to follow the consequences of asking or not asking the question about the observer. What happens? How come that I do whatever I do as an observer? And of the consequences of accepting such a question or of not accepting such a question. This is what I was saying last day, last weekend. If we accept the question, how come that we can do whatever we can do as an observer? We're accepting the question in the domain of operating as observers. We are not getting out of what we are in daily life. It's now here in daily life we say, how come that I can operate as an observer? Hence, if I accept the question, I commit myself to what we do in daily life whenever we accept a question that demands an explanation as an answer. How come that we do what we do as observers? This how come is not a question that begs a description, because the question would be, what do we do when we do observing? That could be listened as a question that begs a description. Or what you do is this and this and this and this and that. But the question, how come that we do whatever we do as we operate as observer, is a question that demands something else, demands an explanation, demands explaining. And I say, and said last week, that explanatory questions demand as answers propositions of mechanisms, of processes of some kind, that if you let them operate, you experience that to explain as a consequence of their operation. That is what we listen for when we listen for an answer to an explanation. There are philosophers that say, well, there are many kinds of explanations, there are descriptive explanations. Yes, one could say that sometimes we are satisfied by a description as an answer to a question that demands an explanation. This sometimes happens. Perhaps the most general way of speaking about explanations will be an explanation is an answer that satisfies the listener who asks an explanatory question, regardless of the shape it gets. That an explanation is like the sucking teat for the baby. The baby is crying, you give the teat, the baby accepts, stops crying. Or this baby doesn't accept that one, throw it away, you have to give another one, and the one that the baby accepts tranquilizes the baby. The baby stops crying. Explanations are tranquilizers. Whenever you accept an answer as an explanation, you stop asking questions. You say, thank you very much. But operationally, what you do indeed, in a more precise way, in explanations as different from descriptions, is propose a mechanism, a process, which if you let it operate, you experience as a consequence that which you wanted to explain. So, I would put here a general term, generative mechanism. So I said last week, if we attend to what I have just said, yes?
Last week you called the tranquilizers pacifiers, but in Australia we call them dummies.
Dummies.
The explanations are dummies for Australia.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Dummies. Very good. But the interesting point here is that if you accept the question about the observer, you commit yourself to propose some dummy under the shape of a generative mechanism such that observing will be the result of the operation of that mechanism. I mean, this is the commitment that one makes. And if you are a scientist, your commitment is that this not only be a generative mechanism, but be a generative mechanism in the context of the criterion of validation of scientific explanations, in the context of the satisfactions of those conditions that make a generative mechanism a scientific explanation. But the important point here is that you are accepting that your characteristics as observers, what you can do as observers, are the result of the operation of you as some kind of system, are not endowments, are not constitutive properties. If you do not accept the question, you proceed treating your abilities as an observer as constitutive properties, as endowments. So I was saying last week that these lead to fundamentally two kinds of attitudes in explaining. And at the same time I call attention to the fact that as one attends to what one does in explaining, and one realizes that explanations are propositions of this particular kind of generative mechanisms accepted by a listener, it turns out that explanations have to do with human relations. Explanations are a particular kind of human relation. Explanations are not explanations in themselves. An explanation is an explanation if it is a generative mechanism proposed as an answer to an explanatory question for a particular experience accepted as such by a listener. Now this is a very interesting situation, because to the extent that this is an analysis about how we do the things that we do as observers, it's an epistemological analysis. We're doing an analysis of the conditions that validate our knowledge, our cognitive statements, our explanations. And yet, perhaps not yet, but in the process, we discover that explanations are special kinds of human relations. An explanation is not an explanation in itself. An explanation is a generative mechanism proposed as an answer for an explanatory question, accepted by a listener as such, according to some criterion that this listener has in his or her listening. Maybe. Well, whenever you become a listener for an explanatory question, you become the questioner too, and this you are right. But I can propose a question here. I'm asking the question, and you are a listener, and you become accepting the question that I'm proposing. So in that sense, there is also a dynamic there. But in the moment in which you accept the question, by becoming a listener for the answer, then you become, you're right, the questioner. Well, but if you do not accept the question, and you reflect or not reflect upon how come that you do what you do, you operate as if your abilities as an observer were constitutive properties. And what is the fundament of your abilities as an observer? Well, doing observing. And what do you do in observing? Well, the same origin of the word in Latin tells you, you operate as something that refers to something that is independent from you. We treat ourselves as observers as entities that have the ability to refer to other entities that exist with independency from what we do. They may be modified by what we do, but their existence is independent from what we do. We may not fully see how they are, but their existence is independent from what we do. So, when we do not accept the question about how come that we can do whatever we can do as observers, we accept, A, that our abilities as observers are constitutive properties of our consciousness, ourselves in some particular way, and the fundamental ability that we have is to make reference to something that is independent from us, and hence to use that which is independent from us to validate our explaining as the criterion through which we accept or reject reformulations, generative mechanisms proposed as explanations or not for the questions that we have. If it refers to matter, then it's an explanation. If it refers to energy, yes. If it refers to God, yeah, I can believe this explanation because it refers to God. If it refers to consciousness, universal consciousness, yes, I can accept this explanation because it refers to universal consciousness. If it refers to energy, oh, energy, yes. If it deals with energy, then I can accept this generative mechanism as an explanation. That means we use many different kinds of existences as criteria of reference for validating our explaining. But in all cases, we operate as if we had a constitutive ability to refer to those entities, matter, energy, mind, consciousness, whatever it is in the particular case when we may be involved, as existing with independency from what we do. So existence here, existence independent from observing. I call this explanatory path objectivity, the path of objectivity. And I said that this is a very interesting path because as we attend to what we do when we speak of objectivity, we realize that we claim objectivity whenever we want the other to do as we say. I am objective means you must do as I say. Be objective means you must do as I say. It is entirely different from this situation. Here you will not really say, well, the objective thing is that No, you would say that what constitutes multiplication is this operation. So if you look at the conditions that constitute multiplication, then you will find that 2 by 2 does not equal 5, but equals 4. So if you specify a particular domain of coherences, then you can claim that you are objective with respect to that domain of coherences. But this is not how we deal with objectivity in daily life. Yeah, we can specify a domain of entities and then operate according to those entities that we have specified as existing with independency from us. But that is no problem. That is not our problem. Our problem is when we have not specified that domain of entities, or we cannot specify it, and we want the other to do as we say, and then we say, I'm objective. Or we may also say, but look how things really are, and we bring forth reality. Subjectivity and reality come here. By the way, reality comes from the Latin res, which means object. So, in fact, reality and objectivity mean the same thing, yes?
So we claim some authority.
We claim authority. We claim a privileged access to what or how things are, so that the other must do as we say, because we have a privileged access to that. This is what happens. But notice, this analysis, which has to do with cognition, with reality, with existence, as one goes into it, not from the abstract philosophical reflection in which you are not involved, but in which you recognize your involvement even when you do not accept this question. But notice that in order to recognize your involvement, by not accepting this question, you must accept the question in principle. Yeah, because if not, you don't question at all anything. But if you do this, if you ask this question and then you reflect upon this, you discover that all these epistemological reflections are indeed reflections on human relations. Yes?
Just reflecting on the meaning of the word objective, I understand that one of the older meanings of it means is to be in opposition to or to stand against. We still use it in court when we say I object. I'm opposed.
Exactly.
I stand in opposition to.
Yeah, this is the idea that exists as opposing to me, but is independent from me. Thank you. Now, when one accepts, I was saying, when one accepts this question, one is committing oneself to propose a generative mechanism, and in this process, you realize that the observer is a living system, and if the observer is a living system, you cannot anymore pretend that you are not aware, that you cannot distinguish in the experience between perception and illusion. So you become aware that you cannot claim that what you say is valid because you can refer to something independent from you. So existence stops being something independent from the observer. And you become aware that existence depends on what the observer does. Because whenever you want to say that something is the case or something exists, since you cannot pretend that reality is independent from you, you must provide an operation of distinction. Which is the operation of distinction? 2 by 2 equals 4. Here is, in a way, displayed the operation of distinction, which is the operation of multiplication. So something becomes what it becomes in the moment of its distinction. I say the observer brings forth whatever the observer distinguishes. Not discovers. Here you would be discovering objectivity without parentheses, you would be discovering. In this other path you cannot claim that you discover, because you cannot claim that whatever you distinguish is that which is independent from you, because it depends on the operation that you perform in the distinction. So existence depends on the observer. Notice that I don't say existence is constituted by the observer. I'm not saying that the observer creates things. I'm saying it depends on what the observer does. This is why I speak about the observer brings forth whatever the observer distinguishes in the operation of distinction that he or she performs. Now, I say it's not easy because we are accustomed to think in terms of things that exist independently from us. And we move in daily life in a world of things that exist with independency from us. And we do not make these reflections. But when we make these reflections and we are serious about it, we discover that we cannot distinguish between perception and illusion. Then we realize that we have no way of claiming that we have discovered something that existed independent from us, because to say that that existed independent from what we do, we would require another reference through which we say, you see, that was like that before you did whatever you did. Now, sometimes we can stipulate that. Sometimes I can stipulate something and say, let this be the case, constituted through these operations, and now let us see how it looks from this perspective. This we can do. Once you specify an entity through the operations of constitution, then you can look around it. But what you look around of is that which was stipulated in the operation of distinction. You are not looking around something that you can claim takes existence independently from what you do. You wanted to make a question?
I did, actually.
Oh, you did it. Okay.
Thank you. It seems to me that you're assuming these distinctions on the basis of sensory perception.
No, I'm speaking about daily life. I have to explain sensory perception, though, but I'm speaking about daily life. You see, you have been doing whatever you have been doing all your life without ever asking yourself about sensory perception until the moment you did for the first time. I do not know when it was, but could it be now only, or could have been 5 years ago when you began to be concerned with whatever it was.
But there are those who claim extrasensory perception and
Yeah.
sensible perception, and I'm wondering whether you would make the same distinctions in that case.
A claim of extrasensory perception is a claim of making a distinction in a domain different from the one that the person stipulates that what he or she distinguishes takes place. For example, if I can say in the domain of objects distinguish, as we distinguish objects, what is in the other room without having been there, then I would claim, well, you see, I have this ability, this extrasensorial ability, because it doesn't have to do with smell, with touch, with vision, with hearing, and things of the sort. And if that claim were presented exactly in those terms, I have the ability to describe what is at the other side without using vision, audition, touch, smell, or hearing. What you would normally do would be to find out what dimension of interaction allows you to do that. For example, you would make experiments of interference, and let's say you put here a lead block that would stop radiations, and you will find out whether I have a particular sensitivity for very short wavelength radiations that can pass through the wall and things of the sort. And perhaps in that way, we can show how come that I do that. That would be the normal way of doing, unless one has other notions behind. And this is the problem with extrasensorial perception. they are not mere cases in which you show that you do certain things that usually people do not do, because that is never a problem. If you do something that other people does not do and you are willing to let to be researched, then of course eventually one may find what happens or one may not find what happens. But you will always attempt to explain that experience with other experiences. So extrasensorial perception is presented in the discourse as something that happens outside the domain of explanations with experiences, because even you are not fully allowed to do this, or when you are allowed and you repeat them, as I have done with my students, at least in the case that I have done it, you find out that there is a flaw in the domain in which the statement is made. For example, a student wanted to do some studies in telekinesis. So I said to him, okay, search in the literature of parapsychology some well-defined experiments through which people claims telekinesis. And he found a very well-described situation of telethermia. According to this experiment, you could create conditions under which you could hit something a certain distance by concentrating your attention upon it. You could hit it or cool it. So we went to a building where there was complete fundamental isolation for ordinary sounds, light. We could control as much as one could control, create a situation where we had a thermocouple which would measure the temperature changes. We put the instrument that would measure the changes in current generated in the thermocouple, and so on and so forth. The experiment was done, and one day the student came to me and said, "Doctor, I can sometimes hit and sometimes cool the object." I said, "Fantastic." We went there, and we found out that the sensitivity that you have to create for the instrument to operate was so high that it oscillated. So certainly sometimes indicated heating and sometimes indicated cooling. So that experiment at least told nothing. Now, whether the phenomenon exists, certainly with that description that we took from a journal of parapsychology, was not shown to be the case, even though it was claimed that one could do that. So one requires the experience. Whatever experience you have is legitimate as an object for explanation, and you will always have to expand your domain of experiences around that to propose a generative mechanism in the domain of experience. If you cannot propose a generative mechanism in the domain of experiences, you don't have an explanation, and then you may resort to miracles, to something else, or leave the question open, which is a legitimate thing to do.
The senses that we have arise in the same way.
The senses that we have arise in the same way. In fact, when I speak about the nervous system, I shall show you that any part of the nervous system where you open a synapse can be a sensory surface. So, but if you want to do an explanation, you must satisfy certain conditions. And if you want to do a scientific explanation, you must satisfy certain conditions in the generative mechanism. Because if you do not satisfy those conditions, then you have something else. You do not have an explanation. And I'm using explanation in the daily life. And scientific explanations are not different from this. The only peculiar thing in scientific explanations is that this generative mechanism is embedded in the satisfaction of a set of other conditions. Okay, so what I was saying, that in this other explanatory path, one became aware that existence depended on what the observer did, and I call this objectivity in parentheses. And by putting objectivity in parentheses, I only mean I am aware that I cannot distinguish, have no way of making an assertion about something that can be claimed to exist with independency from what I do. It's an awareness. Objectivity in parentheses is awareness. I am aware of that. This is not subjectivity. Subjectivity belongs to objectivity without parentheses. Subjectivity is what you claim for the other when it doesn't agree with you when you claim that you're objective. This is awareness. I'm aware that I cannot claim that that is the case independently from what I do. And of course, this has consequences. One of the consequences that has is that you are aware that you cannot demand from the other to agree with you because you have a privileged access to how things are. The most that you can do is to invite the other to participate in the domain of operational coherences in which your statement is valid. Yes?
I'm thinking that, in a sense, objectivity and parenthesis cannot exist within the domain of objectivity.
Not that. You see, you must realize that this is an analysis about what we do. Certainly, if we do not do this reflection, we do not even do this reflection, because we just proceed in the implicit assumption that we have access to an independent reality. If we do this reflection, we realize that we cannot do this claim. So we have reflected upon this, as I have done. But at the same time, you realize that existence depends on what the observer does, and hence there will be many, many domains of operational coherences which you will leave as domains of realities because corresponds to coherences in experience in the same way like here, but aware that you cannot make that claim. So the operationality, the operational coherences, of course, are the same. The difference here is the claim. But this explanatory path refers to the claim. So here you realize that there are many domains of existence, each one defined by some operational coherences of the observer. Physics, for example. Let's say classic physics arises through the operational coherences of measurements of distance, mass, and time. Essentially, football is another domain of operational coherences, another domain of reality. It arises through the application of certain coherences with respect to hitting a ball. Chess, Christianity, Marxism, biology, Euclidean geometry, Riemann geometry, relativistic physics. Relativistic physics arises from the conservation of the definition of identity in terms of horary coincidence. Excuse me, of simultaneity in terms of horary coincidence. If two clocks point to the same hour, two events which are spatially separated are simultaneous. And from that, you bring up, Einstein brought up relativity theory as a domain of operational coherences, without any claim about something independent from what the observer does. This does not mean that these domains of reality are fuzzy or are mishmash. No, they are defined by the operational coherences. And this is why there are many. How many? Depends on how many domains of operational coherences you can bring forth in your experience. So I speak here about many realities. But notice that in this process, reality appears as an explanatory proposition. reality is an explanatory proposition of experience. We explain experience sometimes through reference to a transcendental reality, an absolute reality, or through some other realities that we recognize to be constituted as domains of experiential coherences of the observer. Reality is an explanatory proposition. In the Gregory Bateson's term could be an explanatory principle. But Gregory Bateson uses explanatory principles slightly derogative. I do not want to use this derogatively. I'm not making a derogative statement when I say reality is an explanatory proposition. I'm inviting to an understanding. Here is an explanatory, an objectivity without parentheses is an explanatory proposition and the human relations in which you want the other to do as you say. In this other explanatory path, realities are different explanatory propositions in your awareness that you cannot make reference to something independent from you and where you invite the other to participate with you in that particular domain of experiential coherences where you are making your statement. I also said that in daily life we move from one to the other. So we all have experiences of both domains, even though we do not necessarily have made these reflections. All of us have wanted the other to do what we say. And we say we are rational, we are objective, reality is this way or that way. The Chilean shield of arms has a motto. I was reading the other day about ancient Greece and pre-classic Greece, and the person that was writing about this, Frenchman, said that for the Greeks, reason and force had the same value, a way of forcing the other, of compelling the other to do something. And the Chilean motto, true to the Western tradition, says either by reason or by force. So forgive me, I am a Chilean. But I'm not using the Chilean motto to validate what I say. So rationality is here. No, the use of rationality is here. I'm not saying rationality is here because it's here too. I'm being rational in my discussion. I'm not devaluating rationality. I'm calling attention of what we do when we claim in relation to somebody else with whom we have a disagreement, I'm rational. If I say, look, under these conditions, the conclusion that you have to get is that 2 by 2 equals 4, rationality is implicit, but the domain of rationality is explicit. The domain of rationality is the coherences of multiplication. It's explicit. I have made explicit what constitutes multiplication. But I don't have to say I'm being rational. It's implicit my being rational. But the domain in which my being rational takes place has been made explicit by looking or referring to the conditions of constitution that fundament my argument. In this case, fundament or constitute better multiplication. Here, whenever we are with somebody else whose company we enjoy or we respect, we operate in objectivity in parentheses because we do not demand. We do not say to the other, you must do as I say. You say to the other, oh, please, you committed a mistake because this is what constitutes multiplication. So we invite a participation in a particular domain of reality. Let us suppose that I were to make a statement in Riemann geometry. Riemann geometry differs from Euclidean geometry in the theorem about parallels. Now I don't remember which is I mean, in the Euclidean geometry, two lines are parallel which do not cross ever. You can extend them to the infinite, two straight lines, and they do not cross, and then you generate Euclidean geometry. But you can also have a geometry in which you claim that parallel lines are those lines that, straight lines that if extended, they cross in infinity, or they diverge forever. So you have two kinds of other geometries. I do not remember which one is the Riemann in this moment. But if you were to make a statement in the geometry in which two parallel lines cross in infinity, and this were to be listened from Euclidean geometry, that statement would be inadequate. But since you are with a friend, you say, look, let us see at the fundaments of my geometry. You invite the other to participate in a particular domain of experiential coherence. You are willing to look at the fundaments that give validity to your statement. You do not demand acceptance of validity on transcendental grounds. So here, whenever you are with somebody else that you respect or like, whose company you want, then you operate in objectivity in parentheses, operationally speaking. You may not be aware of all this, but this is what we do. This is why this arrow has to do with emotions, emotioning. Because this has to do with how you relate with the other. At the same time, I said, this that I'm telling to you belongs here. What I say is valid to the extent that you ask the question about the origin of the abilities of the observer, and the observer is a living system. If you take yourself, then this is valid. If you are speaking about some sort of entity in another domain of literature, it's beyond your domain of experiences, it's in literature, you have conceived this other entity, which is not a living system, which is not composed, but has these abilities, then of course what I have said doesn't apply, because you are starting from the implicit understanding or supposition that that entity cannot be analyzed, hence cannot be explained, and this whole reflection doesn't take place. So as soon as this reflection takes place, it's valid, but it's valid in this domain, in the domain in which existence depends on what the observer does. Now, it's interesting, this business of asking or not asking questions. I said also last week that questions both open and close domains. If I do not ask the question, I go into a particular domain of operations, a particular dynamics of human relations. Certain things appear, for example, in this explanatory path. Disagreements entail, fundamental disagreements which are not logical, entail different claims about reality. And when we want to coexist, even though we have these different claims about reality, we resort to tolerance. Tolerance is a very interesting word. If you look it into the dictionary, it's not as beautiful as it seems because it's suspended denial. Now we know this, but sometimes people think, oh, let us be tolerant with this voice. My brothers, let us be tolerant to each other. Right? As if this were a magnificent spiritual expression of acceptance. It's not. It's suspended denial. So here we are tolerant. Now, but if we ask the question, all these reflections appear, which otherwise would not take place, because certainly, if I do not ask the question, my abilities are endowments, do not result from anything else. So I discover here this, I begin to understand what tolerance is, and I realize that here there is something else. I say, there is acceptance or responsible rejection. Why do I say acceptance or responsible rejection? First of all, because you have to accept the legitimacy of the other. You may respect the other and not like the other. And to respect the other means that his existence is legitimate. And not like the other means I don't like the domain of reality that this fellow brings forth in his or her living. But then the rejection results from your disliking, not from the fact that this other person is transcendentally wrong because doesn't see how reality is. Well, in this explanatory path of objectivity without parentheses, most of the time you are not responsible. Because you resort to reality to validate what you say. And then you cannot claim that. You have no ability to do that, so it's a supposition. So you live in demands of the other. You do not take responsibility in your denial of the other. You do not deny the other because you don't like what the other does. You claim that truth, reality, objectivity denies the other. I mean, when I say you, of course, I include myself, we, any one of us. In objectivity in parentheses, then, since the other is accepted because one is aware that one has no privileged access to reality, and you do not like what the other does, then you act according to your disliking, so you are responsible. It's not that the other is mistaken that leads you to do whatever you do against this person. It's your disliking of what this person does. I may think that this person is doing something which is abusive. If I am in objectivity without parentheses, to be abusive is to be intrinsically wrong. This person is intrinsically bad. This is why abuses others. Doesn't see reality, doesn't see objectively. So I fight against abuse in righteousness. I become righteous. I'm not responsible. But here, if I see abuse in terms of a violation of a particular domain of experiential coherences in which I want to live with somebody else. When do we see abuse? We see abuse only if the abused person or the abused nature or the abused animal is acceptable and important to us. You never see abuse where you are not concerned for the abused person, animal, or piece of landscape. And yet, when we want to act against the abusive person, we pretend that we are right. We become righteous. Instead of being responsible and say, aha, I like this person. I see that this particular situation is an illegitimate situation according to such and such domain of coherences in which I like to live. It's in those terms that this behavior is abusive. So I can correct the behavior, or I can invite a reflection on the behavior, or can I even act against this person and destroy this person and take responsibility. I have acted because I don't want the consequences on this person of those actions, and I take responsibility. Let me tell you a story, a little event of my own life in childhood, for which I was highly criticized. I must have been about 16. And in school, one of my fellow students, who was my friend, was the boy responsible for the class book where all the remarks of the teachers were made. I do not know if you have this here, but there was this class book, very important. Marks were there. I mean, it was sort of the diary of this group of students. And one day this disappeared. And was not found. And we all students, boys and girls, got together to talk about this, and we demanded from the person that had taken it away to say that this was the case, because the threat was that this other student that was the responsible one would be thrown away of school. Whether this would have taken place or not, of course, you never know, but you are a student, you are a boy. Then I said, but this person who tells that he or she did this should tell it for the whole school to know. No, he said, it will only be said here. I said, then push me out. Because if I know who did it, because it's told here, I'm going to tell it when the director of the school comes and asks, who was it? So they did not push me out. They did not close my ears or eyes. The person who had done it said, I did it. Then when the director came, said, who did it? Nobody said. Then I said, I shall tell who was it. And I said, who was it? Now, of course, I had been threatened that this fellow would beat me to death or whatever it is. But there I was ready to accept the consequences. I did that, which for many students this was a very ugly action, taking responsibility of the consequences, because I did not want to leave a particular domain of reality. I had not made this reflection. But what I want to show is this is the case. It's an entirely different thing. I was not telling the truth, the truth. I said, I don't want this to happen. And you know that I'm going to tell it, so if you don't want me to tell it, do something. Here I am. I shall not oppose, but take the responsibility of doing something so that I do not know. Because if I know, I'm going to tell. This may be considered a bad action, inadequate action, or a good action, but it's completely different from what you would do here if you consider yourself owner of reality. Here, you take responsibility. I was ready to be beaten by this other fellow. He was bigger than I. He could have beaten me as much as he wanted. He did not do it. He promised to do it, he did not do it. Now, maybe that the teachers, the professor, the director will have not expelled my friend. Maybe, I do not know. How can one know? Now, I think that this is the difference. Here, you act, taking responsibility. Maybe that what you do may be considered adequate or inadequate by somebody else, but you take responsibility. You do not pretend that you have a privileged access to reality and that this privileged access to truth or reality justifies what you do. The other thing that I said that happens here is that, of course, you begin to ask more questions. The whole domain opens for questions. Because you are never more in a domain of hidden realities that maybe you sometime begin to answer, to see what they are, and you do not denying from the very beginning the fundamental question about the observer. Everything is open to question. What is language? What is objectivity? What is object? What is experience? Whatever is open to question. And with the commitment that you will answer with the generative mechanism. Shall we stop for a coffee, you mean? Or 5 minutes? What? 5 minutes, okay. At the same time then, these two explanatory paths give you foundation for two kinds of questions, or better, for two kinds of answers to the questions that you perform. Because here, the question, what is? What is must be answered with a reference to reality, or must be supported in reference to something that's independent from you, or must be defined from some endowment. What is language? A system of symbolic communication, and symbolic communication, symbolization remains as a given ability. What is, whatever it is, there is a being, a reference to a transcendental or to an independent being somewhere. And this is what one looks for properties or for transcendental being. Here is the question, what is? Has a different character. Because you are not asking for something that exists independently from you. You are asking, your isness has to do with a existence that is constituted through the operations of the observer. So whenever you ask, what is such and such a thing, what you are asking is, which are the operations of distinction that constitute that which I'm asking for? If you ask, what is language, what you want is a generative mechanism for the operation of distinction. You want to be told what you have to do to claim that there is language, which is the operation of distinction, or what processes would take place, should take place such that as a consequence of that you distinguish languaging. An entirely different way of answering questions than in the explanatory domain of objectivity without parentheses. Yes?
You define the operation of distinction.
For what? Oh, in general. That which you do to claim that that is the case. For example, if you ask me what is a chair, I can tell a chair is, and I describe a Platonic entity, something that resembles this transcendental chair. Possibly we are not going to say in these days, but you say the chair is that sort of thing there, or you can say what you do to have a chair. What do we have here? A chair? Yes, we have a chair. No, we have a pedestal for a statue. Two different operations of distinction, you get two different things. Now, this in any domain. Domain of human relations, domain of declarations, domain of literature. What do you do to claim that that is the case? What do you do to claim that 2 by 2 equals 4? Or 2 by 2. I claim that to say 2 by 2 equals 5 is the result of this. I am mistaken. Excuse me, I was mistaken. By specifying the operation of distinction, I discovered that I was mistaken. Or the operation of constitution. Yes?
Might not people argue equally vehemently about...
Equally what?
Equally vehemently about what the criteria are, what the operations are to make the distinction, so that the debate moves, so that there's a lot of...
Debate moves into this direction.
No, it stays in the area of objectivity of
No.
parenthesis. But in fact, then the dialogue is around the area of what constitutes the operations of this particular domain.
Certainly.
Or what are the...
Certainly, it can happen. Let us say, for example, that we begin to discuss or to disagree about what constitutes multiplication.
Yeah.
But if we are disagreeing in the isness, then of course we are denying each other.
Right.
But we may, if we are not, we say, aha, so we have two kinds of arithmetics.
Right.
If we have this operation that constitutes multiplication, we have this arithmetic. We have this other arithmetic. With geometry has happened something of the sort.
So then we couldn't disagree, really, because we'd always say that if we disagreed, we were operating in different domains.
Exactly. We realize that we are operating in different domains, and so we say, let's have coffee together.
Every disagreement create a new domain.
Every disagreement could be resolved through the creation of a new domain,
Yeah.
or through the acceptance of the disagreement and separating for doing each one its own thing. Disagreements become legitimate. Here in objectivity without parentheses, disagreements are not legitimate because one or the other is mistaken. Here you realize that none is mistaken. You may not like that, but then you act with responsibility. Take out your gun and boom. But responsibly.
Take, for example, Kuhn's work about what criteria for knowing or for knowledge as such. That seems to me to reduce to a kind of dialogue between scientists about what they agree as being the criteria for knowing. Now, they don't generate new domains every time they have a dialogue, but they might seriously look at each other's criteria for the right to know, in parentheses, and convince each other, that one set might be, with this present time, better than the lot we had 50 years ago.
That is fine then. No problem.
It's friendly.
Yeah, exactly. Not only, you can do things together then.
Yeah.
Maybe you generate a new domain of coherences. Or you respect each other's domains of reality and live together in a different domain having coffee, for example. Or going to the beach to swim. Or whatever it is. But if it does not happen, then you say the other, that schmuck is an idiot. Look, think this and this and this and that and that. And you claim, of course, that this fellow is an idiot because he's blind about reality. And this happens among scientists as much as among other peoples.
Might not there be meta-domains within which we can debate whether one domain might be better than another?
Oh, well, of course, you can do that, but you do it here.
Yeah.
But you cannot do it here because you are stuck with objectivity and reality. But certainly, awareness is an operation in meta-domain. Now, I have not used the expression of meta-domain or meta-domaining so not to be trapped in the operation, but we are doing it. This whole thing is a reflection on what we do. Now we can ask how come that we do meta-domaining? It's a legitimate question. Every question is legitimate now. So, we shall stop for a moment. Very well. Let us go on in this adventure. Yes?
explain again your comment that subjectivity is in the domain of objectivity? Could you just expand on that a bit?
I got it.
Subjectivity. I say that subjectivity belongs to the domain of objectivity because it's a claim with respect to someone that is not seeing how things are and is speaking or reflecting from what happens to him or her. This is what is being said. But that requires the supposition that you can claim how things are. In that sense, belongs to the explanatory domain of objectivity without parentheses. Well, so these two ways of asking questions are very fundamental because they lead or they entailed better these two ways of answering questions, but the way one asks the question specifies what answer it admits, so they go together. You ask the question in the explanatory domain of objectivity without parentheses and you expect an answer in that domain. It is in reference to these two manners of asking and answering questions of the kind what is that I say that these two explanatory paths entail two different ontological domains, two different domains of isness. When one speaks about ontology, one speaks about what one thinks about the isness of things. Transcendental ontologies or ontology, when one thinks that the isness of the thing one is talking about is independent from what one does, hence is transcendental, takes place beyond you. So I call this domain of explanations, or this explanatory path, the domain of transcendental ontologies. One resorts to entities that one takes as existing with independency from oneself to validate one's explanations. Matter, energy, mind, God, whatever it is. Here, I recognize that the isness is constituted by what the observer does. So the isness of a chair is not transcendental. The isness of the chair arises in the operation of distinction chair that brings forth a chair. So the isness of the thing is constituted in its distinction. This is why I speak here about the domain of constitutive ontologies. If you ask me what is the isness of a chair in this explanatory path of objectivity without parentheses, I would have to make some reference to something transcendental. The ideal chair, the chair in itself, of which we only get a sort of glimpse, incomplete view. If you ask me here about the isness of the chair, I said that which is constituted in the distinction of chair. Is there anything more to that? No. Anything less? No. So the thing is constituted in its distinction. Now, but at the same time, it means that the distinctions that we make are never trivial, because they bring forth that which is being distinguished. Now that sounds as if when we're speaking in a domain of complete arbitrariness, but that is not the case. It's not the case because in this explanation, in this explanatory domain, one has to resort to mechanisms. Mechanisms, systems that if you let them operate, you get that which we are talking about. Operations of distinctions, which are operations within the regularities of experience. So in fact, we cannot distinguish just any possible thing. We distinguish that which our operation of distinction brings forth. Sometimes people say, well, if I wish, I can treat this piano as an autopoietic system. Then I say, well, apply the operation of distinction autopoiesis. If the operation of distinction autopoiesis applies, then you get a living system, an autopoietic system. But if it doesn't apply, that means that you do not get that. It's not a matter of wishing. I wish to treat this piano as a living system. Now, you can propose saying, let us interact or talk as if the piano were a living system. And then, of course, we have constituted a domain of coherences in the as if the piano were a living system. But I cannot just claim that I apply the operation of distinction of autopoiesis when I do not apply it. As a child, I can play as if the chair were a piano. Certainly. And I can do many things with that piano as a child. Even I can play with my father or with my mother or with my uncle. And maybe that my uncle, who is a pianist, can teach me piano playing with that piano. Certainly he can. If he is a good pianist, certainly he can. Because what he will teach me is sensomotoric coordinations in the movement of my fingers. But the operation of distinction of piano playing in the domain of listening will not arise. So, if piano is defined as the instrument through which a particular kind of listening takes place in music, then that is not a piano. But in the domain of play, it's a piano. So we can always stipulate things, either in an as-if, which means literature. I'm stipulating that what I shall do is as if I were doing that there, or in the domain of definition of things, saying, let multiplication be, so and so and so. Let us assume, let us take square root of 1 equals I. Minus 1 equals I. And I generate a whole domain of numbers from there. Yes, of course, this I can do. But precisely because I know that are there different domains. So I can make statements in one domain or another domain, or I can make statements in this domain, inviting you to treat them as if they were made in this other domain. But I'm aware that these are as if they were in this other domain because I'm using certain coherences that belong to that here, with whatever consequences this may bring forth. But in any case, in every case, you constitute something. The piano as a toy, the piano as a piano, the piano as a living system in a fabula, in a story, or the living system as a living system in the actual operation of distinction that constitutes the distinction of a living system. Here, we have problems about the distinction because we must find, the thing itself must tell us what it is. What are the boundaries of the living system? Tremendous difficulty. What are the boundaries of a cell? This, when you look at the cell, do you see the boundaries of the cell or not? In this explanatory path, this is a great difficulty. Which are the boundaries of a cell? But if you understand the conditions of constitution, you know that regardless of whether you can point or not, the boundaries of the cell are constituted in the participation in autopoiesis, in the dynamics of operation of the cell. And that which does not participate in it doesn't belong to it. And some molecules sometimes belong to it and sometimes do not belong to it. Like in the club, for example. Which is the extension of a club? Which are the borders of a club? You look here, you have a problem. The club, what kind of entity is the club? In objectivity without parentheses. But in objectivity in parentheses, you know that the club is defined by the operation of constitution of a club. Which kind of relations define a club? Which are the relations of membership? If this person fulfills the relations of membership, is a member of the club. If it doesn't fulfill them, it's not a member of the club, and so on and so forth. Families, societies will depend on the satisfaction or not satisfaction of the relations of constitution of the system. So the whole matter changes character because the isness is not transcendental. Now, sometimes we ask a question in one domain and want to listen to the answer in another domain. For example, I may be asked, can you tell me how things really are in this particular domain of reality? And that, of course, I cannot do because the really are, as is being asked, pertains to here. If I do not, if the question is not in those terms of objectivity without parentheses, then I would say things in this domain of reality are constituted by such and such operational coherences. So these are the things of that domain of reality, those which arise through the application of that operational coherences. But notice that in the explanatory path of objectivity without parentheses, we are always stuck with something that we do not know, which is the isness of it. There is a fixity that is beyond us, and yet we are stuck by it. The family, the person, our own identity. Oh, know thyself. This was the injunction in the Delphos, in the temple of Apollo. Know thyself. That means that you have an identity which is transcendental, that can be known. But here, that know thyself has an entirely different character. Would have to be know thou continuous becoming or something like that. It's not a self that is in itself transcendent and fixed. And people sometimes spend whole life trying to know themselves. Yes?
But isn't that the essence of that injunction? Or that, do you think the oracle was so much of a twit?
No, I think that the oracle was here. The oracle was speaking and validating whatever the oracle said in transcendental reality. Yeah. Or in that sense, is that yes, that is the essence, belongs to that, yes. But I say in our culture, we assume that we have a transcendental identity. And what I'm saying is that that assumption has no fundament.
No, I agree with that, but I just wonder if the oracle really was that narrow-minded, or that limited. I wonder if the sages didn't know the essence of knowing myself was the exercise.
I do not know. I do not know, but the oracles belong to a culture which was, and I shall say a little bit about that. The oracle was a woman, and at the same time this was in a temple led by men, by male priests. So in fact this oracle, the oracle of Delphos, was a mixture of two traditions, a matristic and a patriarchal tradition. But the injunction, know thyself, is a patriarchal one. So if this oracle was in fact under the charge of these patriarchal priests, I would suspect that they were making that injunction precisely. But I mean, we will have to reflect more and perhaps make some research in the cultural history for that. Anyhow, in the moment in which we accept the question about the observer and we enter the explanatory path of objectivity in parentheses, since the isness of the things depends on what we do, we find ourselves in a domain of fluidity. Not infinite fluidity, because we cannot just do anything, but it turns out that there is much more plasticity than what one usually thinks. Plasticity in human relations, plasticity in the characteristics of the persons. It turns out that you can change, the other can change, and there is legitimate domains of change. In fact, the whole dynamic of interpersonal relation is different because you interact with the other, accepting the legitimacy of the other. Okay, I shall leave that there. I wish to say a few words about what I said about language and emotions and go from there. And in the process, I'm trying to answer some of the questions that I receive. I think I have already answered some of the questions that I have received. I said that if we ask the question, what is language? In the explanatory path of objectivity without parentheses, we may answer, and the usual answer is to claim that language is something like a symbolic system of communication. And we hear, if we accept that, we hear that the ability to symbolize is an endowment of the observer. If we do not accept the ability to symbolize as an endowment of the observer, we ask, how come that symbolization takes place? And then we are in fact here accepting the question about the abilities of the observer, because we are treating symbolization not as a constitutive property, but as a result of a manner of operation of the observer. So I said the other day that language, as we reflect upon what we do when we speak about language, what we observe is, or we speak about language when we distinguish or when we operate in coordinations of consensual behaviors. Coordinations of consensual behavior. this could be expressed also in a slightly more complex manner, consensual coordinations of behavior. But synthesizing the thing, saying here, coordinations of consensual behavior. And in this, I'm saying, first, that what is involved is coordinations of behavior. In the understanding that behavior takes place in the relations of the organism, of the living being, or of the entity as a totality in a medium. And in the understanding that the internal dynamics, which I shall call here in general terms physiology, and behavior take place in non-intersecting phenomenal domains. You cannot reduce one to the other. Without behavior, without physiology, you do not get behavior, but no element of the domain of behavior pertains to the domain of physiology and vice versa. So these are two non-intersecting phenomenal domains. So when I speak about coordinations of consensual behavior, I'm speaking about something that happens in the interactions of systems constituted as totalities. But if they are totalities, if they are composite entities, and this is what I mean when I say they are structurally determined systems, and structural determinism belongs to our daily experience. The notion of structural determinism is not a philosophical notion about reality, it's a feature of daily experience, coherences of daily experience. In the same way, I shall say later on that rationality results from the operation in language. And expresses the coherences of operation in language. But operation in language is operation in coordinations of consensual behavior. So language has to do with behavior, with doing. Language is not a domain of abstract notions, references. It's a domain of coordinations of doings. So it has to do with what we do. And words are nodes in networks of coordinations of consensual behavior. This is why words have to do with doings. If you are talking and you use one word, the doing goes in one direction. Now the doing not only means behavior in terms of this organism as a totality, as organism, is behavior can be taken legitimately in any relation of an entity in a domain of existence. So whatever entity you are talking about, you can speak about behavior of this entity. It could be a living system, could be a car, could be a conceptual system in a domain in which this conceptual system is a totality. You can say, how do political ideologies operate in a democratic coexistence? Now that's an interesting question. How do political ideologies operate in a democratic domain of coexistence? You are treating the domain of coexistence, the democratic domain of coexistence, as the medium in which political ideologies are entities and interact as such. It is not visible in these terms, but that question is not a silly question. Okay. So what I was saying when I was saying language is coordinations of consensual behavior, I was saying language takes place in the flow of the coordinations of consensual behavior. Not particular behavior is language. Not particular movement of gesture belongs to language. It belongs to language only to the extent that pertains to the flow of coordinations of consensual behavior. And language then has to do with doing. I also said something about emotions, and I said that emotions were dynamic, body dispositions, that defined or that specified that specify with F or with PH? F, that specify the domain of actions in which an animal moves. Again, I propose this to the question, as an answer to the question, what are emotions, by reflecting upon the conditions of constitution of that which we distinguish as emotions. To what do we attend when we claim such and such emotion in such and such a person or such and such an animal? Don't speak about these matters with so and so. This person is angry. We will not do what you are asking because it's angry. You know that there are certain things that you can do when you are angry, certain things that you can do when you are serene, when you are tender, when you are joyful, when you are sad, when you are fearful. Those processes that we distinguish when we speak about emotions, I claim are domains of actions. Not particular actions, domains of action, domains that specify certain kinds of actions. The same words as part of language of coordinations of behavior in one particular emotion can be an aggression, in another can be an invitation, in another can be a caress. You are charming. You are charming can be an aggression. You are charming. Now you say depends on the intonation. Yes, because we listen, by listening at other dimensions of the wording, we recognize the emotion. But it is not the words by themselves that constitute the aggression, but the emotion in which they are presented or they are listened, or a particular gesture. Could be a threat, or could be a gesture of reception, depending on the emotion, depending on the culture, which defines in what emotion do you listen to a particular word or receive a particular gesture. So what I'm claiming is that if we do this reflection, we can answer these questions about language, what language is, emotioning, what emotioning is. Yes?
Is there a particular reason why you use the body disposition instead of behavior, or vice versa? I mean, are they in your mind?
No, because I'm speaking about the bodyhood. I'm not speaking about behavior here. Let us put a very trivial example. A car. A car with 5 gears. I say a car with 5 gears has five emotional domains. You put in first gear, there are certain things that you can do with your car which you cannot do with in the other gears. You can go forward from standing, you can go up in a very upgrade slope, but you cannot go at 70 kilometers an hour. But if it is in third, you can go at 70 kilometers an hour, but you cannot go up in a very upgrade. Rear, you put in rear, you can do things going backward, you cannot do things going forward. It doesn't belong to the car in a rear gear going forward. This is what I mean. So as you change the gear in the car, you change the disposition for actions of the car. It's exactly that. Am I mechanizing? Well, I'm not mechanizing, but I'm referring about the mechanism.
But isn't there a danger that you're collapsing to non-intersecting domains? You're saying that an emotion is a dynamic body disposition.
Well, since I'm speaking here, you know that I'm speaking about the generative mechanism. So if you ask me, I'll say, well, of course, if I'm not clear that I'm speaking here, that may happen. That danger is always there, and it's always in the speaker and the listener. This is why I said, this I propose from asking the question, what is, in the domain of objectivity, in parentheses. Then I say, you listen for the actions. So whenever we speak about emotions, I said, we're referring to domains of actions. So the isness is constituted. What constitutes emotioning is to flow in changes in the dispositions for actions. And it's a dynamic body disposition for action because it has to do with the bodyhood, with the nervous system, which is dynamics. Thus, it's not behavior. It's not any particular behavior. Yet, of course, a behavior results from these changes here. Now, one of the difficulties that we have is that since we listen usually in objectivity without parentheses, we flatten in the terms that you express your fear. We flatten in our listening, and we forget that we're always dealing with non-intersecting phenomenal domains. That we are always dealing, when we speak about behavior, relations, something that happens in the domain of interactions of a totality, but that this is the result of the operation of the physiology of that totality, and yet does not pertain to the physiology of that totality. So this body disposition pertains to the physiology, dynamic body disposition that specify the domain of actions, the dynamic disposition that specify the domain of actions in which the animal is. The gear specify the domain of possible movements in which the car is. But if you speak aware of this question about the observer, hence in objectivity in parentheses, you must always think that you are, or at least remain aware, that whenever you speak about an entity, there are two non-intersecting phenomenal domains. The phenomenal domain of its composition and the phenomenal domain of its interactions as a totality. And sometimes, you're right, one has to bring it forth, obviously, because if not, the listening flattens this. Our listening usually flattens this with a causal discourse. If I were to say the physiology causes the behavior, I have flattened it. I have lost the view that these are non-intersecting phenomenal domains. And there is a relation of correlation, a generative correlation, which the observer sees, and not a causal relation in terms of how one listens to it, regardless of whatever the history of the philosophical reflections about causality is. One listens as if this, which is the cause, determines that, which is the effect. Yes?
Would I be right in thinking that the relationship between, say, fear, adrenaline, and flight is what you're getting at?
Well, yes. If my adrenaline changes, my dynamic body disposition changes, and my domain of actions appears as something that somebody else is going to call fear. And when this person says, this person is fearful, or this animal is fearful, is referring to this. If I say this animal is pretending to be fearful, then I'm saying hypocrisy is there. This animal is doing as if it were in the domain of fear, but its physiology is not.
So if he's fearful, he's disposed to fly.
He's fearful, is disposed to fly or to attack viciously if it is encroached too much. So there is a whole... The attack of a fearful animal is different from the attack of a non-fearful animal or a person. You know that there's difference because there is different body disposition. And one goes from one to another. Maybe you are fearful and suddenly you become courageous because you see something in the circumstances that gives you support. Just a second. In the Iliad, when Hector is facing in the last moment his battle with Ulysses, the gods cheat him, making him believe that his brother is there to give him his spears. And so fear disappears and he becomes courageous. And he faces not Ulysses, but Achilles. Yes?
I'm not quite sure why I want to ask this question, but I sort of want to flesh it out a bit more. I'm thinking of a psychiatrist who might see a depressed person, and the body disposition of the person who's sad, and decides, flattens physiology with behaviour, and adds to the system a drug of some sort, which supposedly relieves the depression or the sadness. What's your explanation of that process when sometimes the sadness seems to go away and sometimes it doesn't seem to go away?
Well, it depends on what is the dynamic which maintains this disposition, this body disposition, because this is a dynamic process. Now, all systems as dynamic entities conserve their identity in a domain of interactions. So let us suppose this boy or this person is in a depressive state, and you give an antidepressant drug. And the space of relations in which this person is remains the same. So maybe that the dynamics that stabilizes this body disposition, which I recognize as depression, remains, and so my antidepressant either is insufficient to or is transitory in its effects. It's insufficient to produce a change in the body disposition or produces a change in the body disposition which is transitory. Now suppose that I do not give a drug, but I create conditions, because I cannot manipulate the person unless I give a drug, but I can manipulate the circumstances, create conditions in which the dynamics that stabilizes that body disposition disappear, and hence the depression disappears. And this is what is, that it should be dynamic, allows you to understand. Now, I don't pretend that the psychiatrists do not know this. What I'm calling attention is that in our culture, and the psychiatrist belongs to our culture too, this is usually not seen. Emotions are not seen up as disposition, body disposition for action, not as domains of action. Sometimes yes, but not generally, and so there is a misunderstanding about emotions. And we confuse emotions with feelings or sentiments.
That last part just lost me.
No, because I have not said more. This is why you are lost. So, I did not expect you not to be lost. For example, if you tell a teacher at school, the teacher says, I have difficulties with the children. And I come and say, but you have to love them. What does the teacher hear? But of course I love the children. Because she is or he is thinking in terms of a sentiment. Yes, I feel love for my children. Yet, when this person interacts with the child, denies the child identity. Not intentionally, because it's immersed in a particular way of describing what should be done in interaction with children, how they should be corrected, their behavior control, and so on and so forth. And I'm telling you must love the children. What I'm saying? I'm saying you must enter into a particular domain of actions. The domain of those actions that constitute love. I'm not speaking about the domain of feelings or sentiment. Feelings and sentiments are distinctions that we make about how do we move in our particular domain of actions or in a particular descriptions of how we should be in a particular emotion. But feelings have to do with an assessment that we make about how we are in our emotions or in our descriptions about how we are in our emotions. So this is why frequently there is no coincidence between what we call feeling and emotion. You do not love me anymore. You don't bring me flowers. You do not even see that I have changed dress for dinner. You don't love me anymore. I love you. Of course I love you. Excuse me, I was so tired I did not see. You see, the complaint seems to be heard in the domain of sentiment, but strictly it's in the domain of actions. You did not see that I changed dress. Because if you love me, you see me. And this is the complaint. If you love me, you see me. Love is not a sentiment. A sentiment is a reflection about what one is or about how one says that one is in a particular emotion. The emotion is action. Love are those actions that constitute the other as a legitimate other in coexistence with you. And the other is a legitimate other in coexistence with you, you see the other. But if you listen to that, it turns out this very simple, very obvious. You must love your students, means you must interact with them as legitimate others in the domain of coexistence in which you are with them.
So technically speaking, you could shoot the other and call it love.
No, it is not that you could shoot the other and call love. No, no, no. It's not. Please, thank you for the question, but let me use it.
But it's a responsible rejection, maybe.
Yes, could be a responsible denial, but not that you could shoot the other and call it love, but you could shoot the other as an action in love, yes. You say the other is suffering, you realize, has asked you please do something, and you know that this person has no escape, and in film this is very frequently done. I mean, the enemy is coming, this fellow is wounded, please kill me, they are going to torture me if they capture me, so you kill your friend. And that's an act of love, because you are taking the other as a legitimate other in the situation in which the other is. So, killing in itself is one thing, is an aggression, or is an action in love, depending on the emotion.
But it is a responsible rejection, an act of love.
No, it's not a responsible rejection. It could be a responsible rejection. For example, say, oh, this is a fascist. I don't want fascists in my life. I mean, this is seducing our children. I think that the trial and death of Socrates was a responsible rejection. Now, Socrates was accused of perverting the use of Athens, and the perversion was his continuous preaching anti or non-democratic behavior. So the community says, this is a person we cannot live with because he's perverting our use. What shall we do with him? We can banish him or kill him, and we offer the possibility of being banished or dying. And Socrates chooses dying. So the death of Socrates is a responsible action. A responsible rejection of someone that you responsibly consider inadequate for the domain of reality that you are bringing forth. Now, if we do not make this reflection, of course, we don't see this, because we do not bring forth that which we bring forth in the reflection. If we do not make the reflection upon love as a domain of actions, we remain thinking in love as something very special, very unique, very etheric, and we do not realize that it's the foundation of social phenomena. Because, and I shall maintain, that social coexistence is constituted in the domain of acceptance of the other as a legitimate other and coexistent with oneself. If the other is not accepted as a legitimate other and coexistent with oneself, one does not enter, one does not constitute better with the other a domain of social coexistence. So I'm claiming is that love is the emotion that founds social, that constitutes the fundament for social life. Now, could you, please?
May I also add that while domain of love is domain of acceptance, domain of hate is exclusion of the other.
Yeah, exclusion of a particular other.
And that helps in the diagram which you have done last week. The diagram ought to go love to hate this way. And then you have full love and full hate and ambivalence in the middle.
Indifference in the middle.
Yes.
Indifference. Yes, I shall perhaps make it again. Thank you very much.
Could I ask one question just to clear up a little bit uncertain? When somebody says you don't love me, you don't notice the new dress I put on, they are assessing, that's their feeling about the other person's action.
Well, of course, in our culture, this is an assessment of feeling. But at the same time, it implies two things. If you indeed love me, then you would see me. But I'm accusing you, since I have not made this reflection, I'm accusing you of not having the feeling of love. Because I myself do not understand this. For example, in this particular situation, if one has not done this reflection, one does not understand emotions as domain of action. Yet, in daily life, we handle emotions as domain of actions. For example, you can say, no, don't come near that dog. It's furious. I mean, it's dog in aggression, in anger, may bite you. So one is making an assessment, and one is making a reference to the actions, not to the sentiments or feelings of the dog. But in human relation, we usually speak about feelings. But we assess the actions. We look at the action and speak about feelings. So we make confusions. Now, if we clarify these confusions, then this thing clarifies us, because you can say to someone, oh, you must love your students. And this person may understand. Actions that constitute my students as legitimate others. Hence, I should not correct their being, I should correct their actions. This is an interesting difference. Just a second. Normally we correct the being, standardly, usually we correct the being of the child. You are lazy. You should not be lazy. This is what we say. But this is a reference to the being of the child. And the children go home and complain, Mother, whatever I do is wrong. Something must be wrong with me. The professor finds that I am always doing bad things and says that I am lazy or that I am stupid. And the suffering of the child is that his identity is being frozen in the relation with the teacher in being silly or being lazy. The child doesn't say, Mother, I always do things with such effort, such difficulty, I'm always so tired. And the professor tells me that I do things as if I were always tired. But that reflection has to do with the doing, not with the being. If you correct the doing of a child, you respect his or her being. If you correct the being of the child, you don't respect the being of the child. You destroy self-respect, you destroy self-identity, and you interfere with social relations. And not only with the child, with the students in the university, or with the persons in a factory, whoever it is, in the personal relations. Yes?
If I were to write that sentence about emotion, I would say pre-dynamic body disposition. Am I incorrect?
I did not understand.
I would use the word pre-dynamic for want of a better word. Pre-dynamic. In other words, dynamic brings into my mind actual motion, actual
process. No, but this refers to the body disposition which is dynamics. You are inside in a clack, 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 clack all the time. So it was that which I refer. Now what happens is that dynamics is not just any, it is within a particular configuration. One of the things that we do not see, because in the domain of reality we freeze everything into a particular manner of existence, we do not see dynamism. So we do not see that entities may be continuously changing and conserving certain configurations. We tell to the other, oh, why did you change your hair? Why did you let your hair grow that way? This is a rejection of the dynamism of the other. The other has to be in one way. Would you have changed your opinions? Well, last year you were giving a different opinion, now you have changed your opinions. If you say, oh, how interesting, you have changed your opinion, this is a different thing. Because you have acknowledged the legitimacy of the change and you have recognized it. But if you say, but you have changed your opinion, last year you were of this other opinion, then you are rejecting the change. Now we live, since the identity must be constant, so the opinions cannot change. The representative in the Senate must say the same thing for 40 years. Oh, 20 years ago you said blah, 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 blah. And you are accused of what you said 20 years ago because now you say something different. 20 years have passed, sir. But it is because of this. Now, if you accept the dynamism, then a particular emotion is a dynamic inner situation, and yet conserves a certain configuration, and you can change configuration. I say, and I said last week, and I repeat it because I think it's important to stress it, that it is the emotion that defines the action. It's not what you do in terms of the actual doing, the actual operation, in terms of the words, it's the emotion. If you want to know the action, you listen to the emotion. Whenever you say, this action is an aggression, you are listening or you are thinking that the emotion is a particular one. I am offended, you are aggravating me, you are claiming that the emotion defines that action is anger of some kind. If you want to know the action, you look at the emotion. If you want to know the emotion, you look at the action. Ah, this action is aggressive. The emotion is anger. This fellow is anger. This action is aggression. You want to know the emotion, you look at the actions. You want to know the actions, you look at the emotion. Now, this means, of course, that under these different circumstances, we attend to different configurations. For example, we can recognize the emotion by looking at the manner of movement, the posture, because it's a disposition which specifies a class of actions, a domain of actions, a class of actions. You may not be in the flow of it, but the disposition is apparent in how you stand, how you move, how your shoulders are, how you pose your head. You walk like this, you walk like this. You know all this, but one makes the assessment and one knows what actions will come. Or you are looking at the actions. You have reason to think this is aggression because of the particular circumstance. Say the emotion is anger. Okay, I think that with that, I have in essence reconstituted what I said last week, at the same time emphasized certain things that I wish to use today and tomorrow for what I want to say, and I shall tell you what I want to say. I want to speak about social systems, about culture, and about the origin of the particular culture to which we, you, I, Chileans, Australians, as descendants of Europeans, belong. And how the origin of the culture to which we belong the understanding of that origin can lead to some understanding of the kind of sufferings that we live, and hence to the kind of problems in interpersonal and individual relations we have. For that, I wish to say some things about the nervous system, to show how come that what we say has consequences in our physiology. How come that the manner we live has consequences in our bodyhood, and what happens in our bodyhood has consequences in the manner we live. And I shall say a few things about evolution, biological evolution, to explain the origin of language. And then I shall propose to you an interpretation of the origin of patriarchality and of the origin of our European patriarchal culture, the particular kind of patriarchal culture to which we belong. And this is a work I have been doing with a German colleague, Dr. Soller, who works with children. But this will be, let's say, the completion of what I want to say, and that I shall do tomorrow. But for that, today in the afternoon, I shall speak about the nervous system and maybe begin to speak about evolution in relation to the origin of language. So we can stop now for lunch. You said 12 o'clock was an adequate time.